Some neighborhoods looked
This
peaceful,
is ours. Give it
only
back.
because
We're just
nobody
checking it's
dared to
clear now.
challenge the people who believed they owned them. Willow Creek Estates was one of those places. The tree-lined streets, perfectly trimmed lawns, colorful flower beds, and matching mailboxes created the illusion of harmony. Visitors admired the quiet atmosphere, believing everyone lived happily together. What they could never see was the invisible pressure hanging over every homeowner. Every lawn was cut not because people loved gardening, but because someone was always watching. Every trash bin disappeared exactly on schedule because someone was ready to report it. Every family knew the same unwritten rule: never become Karen Whitmore's next target. Karen had lived in Willow Creek for nearly 15 years. She wasn't the HOA president, but she acted like she had personally written every rule in the community handbook. Most residents had stopped questioning her years ago. They simply paid unnecessary fines, apologized for things they hadn't done, and avoided confrontation whenever possible. Fear was easier than fighting. That fear had slowly transformed Karen into something even more dangerous than an ordinary busybody. She believed she was untouchable. Every week she walked through the neighborhood carrying a clipboard and taking photographs. A bicycle leaning against a garage. A flower pot placed a few inches outside HOA recommendations. Children's chalk drawings that hadn't yet washed away after a summer rain. Nothing escaped her attention. Some people joked that she knew every mailbox in Willow Creek better than the mail carrier did. Unfortunately, the joke would soon become reality. Across the street from Karen lived Ethan Brooks, a 38-year-old high school history teacher who had moved into the neighborhood just 6 months earlier after caring for his late father's estate. Unlike many homeowners, Ethan wasn't wealthy. He had spent years saving enough money for a modest home with a small front yard and a white picket fence. After years of apartment living, owning even a simple house felt like an incredible achievement. His greatest pride wasn't the house itself. It was the handmade wooden mailbox standing beside the sidewalk. His father had built it. Years before passing away, Ethan's father had carefully carved the mailbox from cedar wood in his workshop. Every corner had been sanded smooth. Every piece had been measured by hand. A small engraved oak leaf decorated one side, symbolizing strength through difficult seasons. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't flashy. But it was priceless to Ethan. Before installing it, he carefully reviewed every HOA guideline. The height matched regulations. The distance from the curb was correct. The post dimensions complied with county standards. Even the mailbox color fit neighborhood requirements. He had done everything properly. At least, that's what he believed. Karen noticed the mailbox the very first morning after installation. She slowed her morning walk. She examined it from every angle. She frowned. Then she quietly took 3 photographs before continuing down the sidewalk. By that afternoon, Ethan discovered a handwritten note taped to his front door. It wasn't an official HOA notice. It wasn't signed. It simply warned that the mailbox was non-compliant and should be removed immediately before authorities became involved. Ethan assumed someone had made a mistake. He reread the HOA handbook that evening. Everything matched. Confident there had been a misunderstanding, he ignored the anonymous warning. That decision unknowingly placed him directly into Karen's crosshairs. Over the following week, strange things began happening. Another anonymous letter appeared. Someone measured the mailbox with a tape measure while Ethan was at work. Neighbors mentioned seeing Karen stopping outside his house almost every afternoon. The mailbox hadn't changed. Neither had the regulations. Only Karen's determination had grown. Most residents would have replaced the mailbox simply to avoid trouble. Ethan couldn't. Removing it would mean throwing away the final gift his father had ever made. He refused to believe anyone could be so unreasonable over something that followed every rule. He underestimated just how personal Karen's obsession had become. Soon she began filing formal complaints with the HOA board. She claimed the handcrafted mailbox lowered neighborhood property values. She insisted it looked unprofessional. She argued it attracted too much attention. The board reviewed her complaint. After comparing measurements with HOA regulations, they dismissed it. Case closed. For most people, that would have been the end. For Karen, it was only the beginning. She convinced herself the HOA board had become lazy. If they refused to enforce the rules, she would find someone who would. Every morning, she watched Ethan leave for work. Every afternoon, she photographed the mailbox again. Every evening, she added another page to a growing folder labeled simply Mailbox Violations. Weeks passed. The neighborhood quietly watched events unfold. Many residents recognized exactly what Karen was doing. None dared interfere. They had seen this pattern before. Karen selected a target. She escalated small complaints. Eventually, the homeowner gave up. Karen always won. At least, she always had. Then came Saturday morning. The weather was beautiful. Families walked their dogs. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Gardeners watered flowers. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Until two police vehicles slowly entered Willow Creek Estates. People looked up from their yards. Curtains shifted. Garage doors opened. The officers stopped directly outside Ethan's house. Karen stood nearby with folded arms, looking unusually confident. She had finally done it. Unable to convince the HOA to punish Ethan, she had called the police. According to her report, the mailbox created a public safety hazard, violated federal postal regulations, obstructed visibility, and posed an immediate danger to pedestrians. The accusations sounded serious enough that officers were required to investigate. Ethan had just stepped outside to collect his morning newspaper when he saw the patrol cars. Confused, he calmly walked toward the officers. The entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Karen watched with unmistakable satisfaction. After weeks of complaints, photographs, reports, and failed HOA hearings, she believed justice had finally arrived. What she didn't know was that the responding officers weren't interested in assumptions. They preferred facts. And facts have a way of exposing people who confuse personal grudges with public safety. As one officer carefully examined the handcrafted mailbox, taking measurements and comparing them against official postal regulations, Karen's confident smile slowly began to fade. For the first time since Ethan had moved into Willow Creek, the investigation was no longer under Karen's control. And before the day was over, the person who had dialed the police expecting someone else to pay the price would discover that making a false complaint carried consequences she had never imagined. The quiet street that had spent years watching Karen intimidate one neighbor after another was about to witness something entirely different. For once, karma wasn't running late. It had just arrived. The silence that settled over Willow Creek Estates carried a different weight than usual. For years, silence had been the neighborhood's way of surviving. It had protected residents from becoming Karen Whitmore's next target. It had allowed small injustices to pass without challenge. It had convinced ordinary families that enduring unfair treatment was easier than confronting it. But on this particular Saturday morning, silence meant something entirely different. It meant everyone was waiting to see what the truth would reveal. The two police officers approached Ethan Brooks' mailbox with quiet professionalism. They neither accepted Karen's accusations nor dismissed Ethan's confidence. They simply began gathering facts. One officer carefully examined the mailbox post, while the other reviewed the report that had brought them there. According to Karen's complaint, the mailbox violated federal postal standards, obstructed drivers' visibility, and posed an immediate danger to pedestrians. She had even described it as a hazard requiring urgent police intervention. Those were serious allegations. If they had been true, the officers would have been obligated to act. Instead, the inspection told a very different story. The mailbox stood exactly where it should. Its height fell within postal guidelines. The distance from the curb matched county recommendations. The wooden structure was stable, firmly secured, and showed no signs of creating any danger whatsoever. The officer measuring the post checked his notes twice before quietly nodding to his partner. Everything complied. Nothing supported the complaint. Ethan remained calm throughout the inspection. He understood that the officers were simply doing their jobs. There was no anger on his face, only quiet patience. He knew he had followed every rule before installing the mailbox. Karen, however, began losing the confidence she had displayed only moments earlier. She expected the officers to remove the mailbox immediately. She expected Ethan to receive citations. She expected another victory. Instead, she watched as the investigation slowly dismantled every claim she had made. The officers then asked a simple question. When had Karen personally measured the mailbox? The question caught her off guard. Until that moment, she had never imagined anyone would examine the accuracy of her statements. She attempted to explain that she had observed the violations herself over several weeks. The officer politely asked whether she had used official measuring equipment. She had not. Another question followed. Had she contacted the local postal service before claiming the mailbox violated federal regulations? Again, the answer was no. The officer made another note. Then came the question Karen least expected. What evidence suggested the mailbox created a public safety hazard? For several long seconds, Karen struggled to answer. She spoke about appearance. She mentioned property values. She referred to neighborhood standards. None of those reasons explained how the mailbox endangered anyone. The officer quietly explained that personal dislike and legal violations were not the same thing. Nearby, several neighbors had gathered at a respectful distance. No one interrupted. No one whispered loudly enough to interfere, yet almost everyone recognized what was happening. For years, Karen had presented her opinions as facts. Now facts were finally taking center stage. As the inspection continued, the officers noticed something unusual. Karen carried a thick folder under her arm. When asked about it, she explained it contained evidence collected over several weeks. The officers briefly reviewed its contents. Dozens of photographs, handwritten notes, printed copies of HOA regulations with highlighted sections, pages of personal observations. What surprised the officers wasn't the amount of documentation. It was how little of it supported her claims. Nearly every photograph simply showed Ethan's mailbox from different angles. Some images had circles drawn around decorative carvings. Others included handwritten comments suggesting the mailbox looked suspicious or appeared too decorative. None demonstrated any actual violation. The officers returned the folder politely. One of them gently reminded Karen that repeated complaints without factual basis could unnecessarily consume public resources. The words landed harder than any formal warning. For the first time, Karen realized the investigation had shifted away from Ethan entirely. Now her own actions were under review. Meanwhile, Ethan quietly retrieved a folder from inside his home. Unlike Karen's collection, his contained official documents. There was the county installation permit, measurements recorded during installation, copies of the HOA architectural approval, a receipt from the licensed contractor who had helped anchor the mailbox post. Finally, there was one document that immediately caught the officer's attention. A written acknowledgement from the local postal service confirming the mailbox met delivery requirements. The officers carefully reviewed every page. The paperwork removed every remaining question. The complaint had no factual foundation. As neighbors watched from nearby driveways, something remarkable happened. The officers thanked Ethan for his cooperation. Then they turned back toward Karen. Their tone remained respectful, but noticeably firmer. Emergency services existed to address genuine public safety concerns. False or exaggerated complaints diverted time from people who truly needed assistance. The officers explained that while citizens should always report legitimate concerns, intentionally misrepresenting situations could result in penalties under local ordinances. Karen's expression changed instantly. Only minutes earlier, she had stood confidently with folded arms. Now uncertainty replaced certainty. She attempted to argue that she had only been protecting neighborhood standards. The officers calmly explained that neighborhood preferences belonged to the HOA. Police officers enforced laws. Those were two very different responsibilities. The distinction echoed through the small crowd of neighbors. Many exchanged quiet glances. Some appeared relieved. Others simply seemed astonished that someone had finally explained the difference aloud. One elderly resident standing across the street remembered receiving 3 HOA complaints from Karen over flower pots placed inches outside her porch. Another family recalled being reported because their grandson's bicycle had remained in the driveway for less than an hour. A retired veteran remembered Karen demanding that he repaint his mailbox because the shade of white didn't match community expectations. Individually, each incident had seemed too small to fight. Together, they revealed a pattern. For years, Karen had relied on one assumption. Nobody would challenge her. Now that assumption was beginning to crumble. The officers informed Karen that the complaint would be documented as unfounded. Additionally, because emergency services had been dispatched based on inaccurate claims presented as factual violations, the matter would be forwarded for administrative review under the municipality's false reporting policy. It was not an arrest. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was something Karen had never experienced before. Accountability. As the patrol vehicles prepared to leave, the neighborhood slowly returned to life. Children resumed riding bicycles. Garden hoses turned back on. Dogs continued their morning walks. Yet something fundamental had changed. People no longer looked at Karen with quiet resignation. They looked at her with uncertainty. The image of unquestioned authority she had carefully built over 15 years had developed its first visible crack. Karen walked back toward her house, carrying the same folder she had proudly brought to the investigation. Only now it felt heavier. Much heavier. Across the street, Ethan stood beside the handcrafted mailbox his father had built years earlier. He gently brushed a bit of dust from the carved oak leaf before returning inside. The mailbox had survived the investigation. But the story wasn't over. By Monday morning, the HOA board would receive a copy of the police report. Several neighbors who had remained silent for years would decide they had remained silent long enough. And Karen was about to discover that the most expensive fine she would face wasn't measured only in dollars. It would cost something she had spent years taking for granted. The trust of an entire community. Monday morning arrived with the same quiet sunshine that usually settled over Willow Creek estates, but the neighborhood no longer felt the same. For years, every week had begun with an unspoken sense of caution. Homeowners mowed their lawns a little earlier than necessary, hid children's toys before leaving for work, and double-checked every small detail around their homes, not because they feared breaking the rules, but because they feared becoming Karen Whitmore's next target. That invisible tension had become part of everyday life. Most families barely noticed it anymore, until it began to disappear. News of Saturday's police investigation spread faster than anyone expected. No dramatic headlines appeared. No television crews arrived. Yet within 2 days, every household in Willow Creek knew exactly what had happened. People learned that Ethan's mailbox had passed every inspection. They learned that Karen's accusations had been officially determined to be unfounded. Most importantly, they learned that even someone who acted powerful could be held accountable. For the first time in years, neighbors started talking openly. Small conversations began during morning walks. Parents chatted while waiting for the school bus. Retired couples lingered at their fences a little longer than usual. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same realization. Karen had only been as powerful as everyone believed she was. Once that illusion cracked, the fear surrounding her began to fade. Ethan had no intention of becoming the center of attention. He continued teaching history at the local high school, tended to his small vegetable garden after work, and smiled politely whenever neighbors thanked him for standing his ground. He never claimed to have defeated anyone. He simply refused to surrender something that mattered to him. That quiet confidence inspired people more than any angry confrontation could have. By Wednesday evening, the HOA board received something entirely unexpected. Letters. Not one. Not two. Nearly 20 written statements from homeowners describing their own experiences. Each story seemed small on its own. A family fined over holiday decorations that complied with community guidelines. An elderly widow repeatedly photographed while planting flowers. A young couple reported because their grandchildren left bicycles on the driveway during weekend visits. A disabled veteran pressured to remove a temporary accessibility ramp before receiving proper approval. None of these incidents had resulted in major penalties. That was precisely the problem. Karen had rarely crossed obvious legal boundaries. Instead, she relied on intimidation, persistence, and the assumption that no one wanted conflict. The letters painted a picture the HOA board could no longer ignore. This wasn't about one mailbox. It was about years of unnecessary harassment. The board scheduled a special community meeting for the following Saturday. Attendance was optional, yet almost every seat filled before the meeting officially began. Residents who had rarely spoken at HOA gatherings quietly waited together. There was no shouting, no hostility, only curiosity. Karen entered the meeting carrying her familiar binder. She sat near the front, as she always had. For years, that seat symbolized confidence. This time it felt isolated. The meeting began routinely. Financial reports, landscaping updates, maintenance schedules. Then the board president reached the final agenda item: community conduct. The room became perfectly still. One by one, written statements were summarized without naming individual homeowners. The board emphasized that HOA guidelines existed to maintain shared property standards, not to encourage personal disputes. Repeated monitoring of neighbors. Constant photography without legitimate purpose. Excessive complaints unsupported by evidence. Attempts to use outside agencies for personal disagreements. None reflected the values the neighborhood wished to promote. Karen listened quietly. For perhaps the first time in many years, she wasn't the one directing attention toward someone else. Attention had found her instead. The board then announced an important policy change. From that point forward, anonymous complaints would no longer trigger enforcement action. Any homeowner submitting repeated complaints would be required to provide factual evidence before investigations began. Complaints already reviewed and dismissed could not be repeatedly resubmitted without new information. Additionally, homeowners were encouraged to communicate respectfully with neighbors before filing formal reports whenever possible. The room remained silent for several moments. Then something unexpected happened. People applauded. Not loudly. Not triumphantly. Simply with relief. The applause wasn't celebrating Karen's embarrassment. It was celebrating the return of common sense. Karen lowered her eyes. The board wasn't accusing her directly. They didn't need to. Everyone understood why those changes were being adopted. After the meeting ended, neighbors slowly gathered outside beneath the warm evening sky. Conversations continued naturally. Families introduced themselves despite having lived on the same street for years. Children played together, without parents constantly looking over their shoulders. The atmosphere felt lighter. It reminded many residents of why they had moved into Willow Creek in the first place. Community, not control. Meanwhile, another letter quietly arrived at Karen's home. Unlike the anonymous notes she once left on others' doors, this envelope carried an official municipal seal. Inside was the administrative review she had been warned about. Following the police investigation, local authorities had concluded that emergency services had been dispatched based on materially inaccurate claims. As a result, Karen received a civil penalty for misuse of public emergency resources. The financial fine itself wasn't enormous. It amounted to several $100s. Enough to matter. Not enough to ruin anyone. But the amount wasn't what troubled Karen most. It was the explanation attached beneath it. The document carefully reminded citizens that emergency responders must remain available for genuine public safety concerns. Knowingly exaggerating situations or presenting personal disputes as emergencies undermined that responsibility. Karen read those words several times. Each reading felt heavier than the last. For years, she believed she had been protecting the neighborhood. Now official documents described her actions as misuse. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Across the street, Ethan spent Saturday afternoon restoring the finish on his father's handcrafted mailbox. He carefully sanded tiny imperfections before applying a fresh protective coat. As sunlight reflected across the polished cedar wood, the carved oak leaf appeared brighter than ever. Several neighbors stopped to compliment the craftsmanship. Many admitted they had never truly noticed how beautiful the mailbox was until all the controversy forced them to look closely. Ethan smiled modestly. The mailbox had never been about appearances. It represented his father, his memories, his promise never to let fear erase something meaningful. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the rows of maple trees, Willow Creek looked different. The houses hadn't changed. Neither had the sidewalks. Even Karen's home appeared exactly as it always had. But the people had changed. They greeted one another more often. They spent more time outside. Children laughed a little louder. Neighbors who had once hurried indoors after work now remained outside talking until sunset. Trust had begun returning to the community. Yet inside Karen's house, another realization slowly took shape. The financial penalty could be paid with a single check. Repairing 15 years of damaged relationships would be far more difficult. And she was about to discover that money could settle a fine. It could never purchase respect. That would have to be earned. One choice at a time. The official fine was paid before the end of the month. Karen Whitmore mailed the check without delay, determined to close the chapter as quickly as possible. From a financial standpoint, the matter was over. But Willow Creek Estates had learned something that could not be forgotten. Some consequences never appear on a bank statement. For the first time in nearly 15 years, Karen no longer began her mornings with a clipboard in one hand and a camera in the other. The long walks through the neighborhood continued, but they looked very different. Instead of stopping at every driveway to search for violations, she walked with her eyes fixed on the sidewalk. It wasn't because the neighborhood had suddenly become perfect. It was because she had finally realized that perfection had never been her responsibility. The residents noticed the change almost immediately. Mailboxes were no longer photographed. Flower beds remained undisturbed. Children left bicycles on driveways for an afternoon without wondering if a warning letter would appear before dinner. The neighborhood seemed to breathe again. It was a freedom many homeowners hadn't realized they had been missing. For Ethan Brooks, life returned to the quiet routine he had always wanted. Each weekday, he taught history to teenagers, reminding them that societies were shaped not only by famous leaders, but also by ordinary people who chose fairness over fear. After school, he returned home to water his garden, read on his porch, or spend time restoring little details around the house his father would have been proud of. The handcrafted mailbox remained exactly where it had always stood. Now, however, people noticed it for the right reasons. Neighbors admired the careful woodwork. Visitors often slowed down to appreciate the carved oak leaf. Even the local mail carrier commented that it had become one of the most recognizable mailboxes on the route. What had once been the center of unnecessary controversy had quietly become a symbol of perseverance. One afternoon, several weeks after the police investigation, the HOA board announced a community improvement day. Rather than focusing on violations, residents would work together to plant flowers around neighborhood entrances, repaint aging benches, and clean the small community park. Participation was voluntary. To everyone's surprise, nearly every household joined. Families arrived carrying gardening tools. Teenagers painted fences. Retirees shared landscaping advice. Children planted flowers with oversized gloves that kept slipping off their hands. The atmosphere felt nothing like previous HOA gatherings. Instead of rules, people talked about ideas. Instead of complaints, they offered help. Instead of searching for problems, they searched for ways to improve the place they all called home. Ethan volunteered throughout the day, quietly repairing one of the wooden benches that had become weathered over time. As he sanded the rough edges, he found himself thinking about his father. His father had always believed that things worth keeping required care. Not because they were perfect, because they mattered. That lesson had shaped far more than a mailbox. It had shaped Ethan's character. Late that afternoon, something happened that no one expected. Karen arrived. There was no clipboard, no camera, no binder filled with handwritten complaints. She simply walked toward the community garden, carrying a tray of bottled water for the volunteers. Several conversations paused as people noticed her. No one knew what to expect. Months earlier, many would have assumed she had arrived to criticize someone's work. Instead, she quietly placed the drinks on a nearby table and joined a group planting flowers along the entrance sign. She worked without drawing attention to herself, without offering explanations, without asking for forgiveness. Actions, she seemed to understand, carried more weight than words. Some residents remained cautious. Others appreciated the effort. Most simply watched. Trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt in a single afternoon. It required consistency. Weeks turned into months. Karen continued changing. She stopped treating the HOA handbook as a weapon and began seeing it for what it was always intended to be, a guide for shared responsibility. When neighbors had questions about community rules, she encouraged them to contact the board rather than offering her own interpretations. When disagreements arose, she suggested conversations before complaints. When new families moved into Willow Creek, she welcomed them with homemade cookies instead of unsolicited warnings. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. Real change usually is. One crisp autumn evening, the HOA held its annual neighborhood picnic in the community park. It was the largest turnout anyone could remember. Children played games beneath colorful banners. Grandparents shared stories on folding chairs. Neighbors who had once barely exchanged greetings now laughed together over homemade desserts. The atmosphere reflected something the neighborhood had nearly lost forever: belonging. Near sunset, the HOA president thanked everyone for making the year one of the strongest in the community's history. Property values had improved. Participation in neighborhood events had nearly doubled. Complaints had dropped dramatically. More importantly, residents reported feeling happier living there. The improvements hadn't come from stricter enforcement. They had come from stronger relationships. As the gathering slowly came to an end, Ethan walked home beneath the golden light of the setting sun. Before entering his house, he paused beside the mailbox. His fingers gently traced the carved oak leaf his father had shaped years earlier. He remembered the day they built it together. The smell of fresh cedar. The sound of laughter in the workshop. His father's patient hands guiding every cut. At the time, neither of them could have imagined that such a simple object would one day teach an entire neighborhood about courage. Not the courage to fight. The courage to stand peacefully for what was right. Across the street, Karen watched families saying goodbye to one another. For a long moment, she reflected on everything that had happened. The police call. The investigation. The fine. The embarrassment. None of those had been the hardest consequence. The hardest part had been realizing how many years she had spent trying to control neighbors instead of getting to know them. She had confused authority with respect. She had mistaken fear for influence. Only after losing both had she begun understanding the difference. The money she paid to the city had eventually been forgotten. But the lesson remained. A community does not become stronger because people constantly search for one another's mistakes. It becomes stronger when people protect one another's dignity. Months later, visitors driving through Willow Creek often admired the tidy homes, blooming gardens, and welcoming atmosphere. Many noticed one handcrafted cedar mailbox standing proudly near the entrance to a quiet street. To them, it was simply a beautiful mailbox. To the people who lived there, it represented something far greater. It reminded them that truth is stronger than intimidation. That fairness outlasts fear. That kindness leaves a legacy no complaint can erase. And that sometimes, the greatest victory isn't proving someone else wrong. It's helping an entire community remember what it means to be neighbors again.